When my daughter-in-law, Sarah, finally dropped her mask of civility and screamed across the lawyer's polished mahogany table, "You have no right! That trust fund is ours!" I simply slid a copy of the sound character clause toward her and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The look on her face as she finally understood that her secret rushed wedding had just cost her access to $500,000 was, to be frank, the most satisfying entry in my ledger in years. My name is Margaret Vance, though everyone who has ever known me calls me Maggie. And for 71 years, I have lived a life governed by the comforting certainty of numbers and order. As a retired accountant, I find a unique peace in balanced ledgers, in clear, logical conclusions where every debit has its corresponding credit. For years after my beloved husband Richard passed, my quiet, orderly life had only one variable, one emotional entry that never seemed to balance: my boundless love for my only son, Ethan. I poured everything into him, my time, my energy, and, as I would soon be forced to calculate, far too much of my money. I believed that providing for him, ensuring his comfort and happiness above my own, was the final, most important calculation of my life as a mother. I was wrong. I had forgotten the first, most fundamental rule of accounting. You must always, always verify the assets before you invest. My late husband, Richard, was a prudent man, a brilliant engineer who built a small fortune through diligence and foresight. But he had a single glaring blind spot: Ethan. This inherited softness, this paternal desire to shield his son from life's hard knocks, had resulted in Ethan developing a rather casual, almost aristocratic relationship with financial responsibility. The memories of my generosity are not singular, dramatic events, but a slow, steady erosion of my own security, like a river eating away at its banks, one grain of sand at a time. I remember with a painful clarity that still tightens my chest the year Ethan decided to launch a tech startup with his university friends. It was a venture fueled more by youthful arrogance and trendy buzzwords than by a sound business plan. When it inevitably collapsed in a spectacular fashion just 6 months later, it left him with a mountain of credit card debt, over $30,000 that he had no means to repay. He came to my house late one evening, his face a mask of shame and youthful panic. "I'm ruined, Mom," he had whispered, his gaze fixed on my worn-out floral carpet, unable to meet my eyes. As a retired accountant, every fiber of my being, every logical instinct I possessed, screamed at me to let him face the consequences, to teach him the hard, cold lesson of a balance sheet that is deep in the red. But as a mother, watching my only child crumble, I couldn't bear it. I took a significant, premature withdrawal from my own retirement annuity, the nest egg Richard and I had so painstakingly built for my old age, and paid off his entire debt in a single, painful transaction. "This is a fresh start, son," I had told him, my hand on his shoulder, desperately hoping it would be a turning point. Instead, it merely became a precedent. A few years later, before he and Sarah were even engaged, they decided they needed a pre-honeymoon trip to Italy to solidify their bond before taking the next big step. Ethan explained it to me as if it were a perfectly reasonable, even necessary expense. I didn't have that kind of cash on hand, not after the startup fiasco. So I sold my reliable old sedan, the car that had served me faithfully for over a decade, my one small symbol of independence. I gave them the $5,000. I told myself that their happiness, their bond, was more valuable than my convenience. I started taking the bus. And Sarah, in those early days, was a master of appreciation, a virtuoso of heartfelt gratitude. She was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She was bright, effusive, and unfailingly sweet. She would bring me flowers for no reason. praise my simple pot roast as if I were a world-class chef, and listen to my old stories about Richard with what appeared to be genuine heartfelt interest. She called me Maggie, but often, in moments of carefully staged intimacy, her hand on my arm, her eyes shining, she would call me Mom. "You are the second mother I never had," she told me once, her eyes welling up with what I was utterly convinced were sincere tears. "You are so incredibly generous to us. I don't know what we'd do without you." She painted a beautiful, vivid picture of our future, a perfect triptych of family harmony. She spoke of the grandchildren she would give me and how they would spend their summers at my house, filling its quiet rooms with laughter. She talked about how, when I grew older, they would insist I move in with them so they could repay all the kindness I had shown them. I believed every single beautifully crafted word. I saw in her the loving, stable partner that my sometimes directionless son so clearly needed. I saw a future filled with family dinners, holiday celebrations, and the easy, comfortable love of a family united. I was investing in that future, I told myself, every time I wrote a check or paid one of their bills. I, a meticulous accountant, had somehow failed to see that this perfect family portrait she was painting was a clever forgery, and my own signature was at the bottom. The first discrepancies in Sarah's perfectly balanced ledger of affection were subtle, the kind of minor accounting errors a sentimental auditor might overlook. They began not with demands, but with seemingly innocent questions, always posed in a tone of casual, friendly curiosity, as if the thought had just occurred to her. We were having lunch one sunny afternoon in my small garden, and she tilted her head, a thoughtful, almost academic look on her face. "Maggie," she began, her voice a soft purr. "Richard was such a brilliant businessman, wasn't he? I mean, he was practically a legend at his firm. I bet he was incredibly smart with his long-term investments. He must have left Ethan with a very, very secure future." I was taken aback for a moment, not by the question itself, but by its directness, its focus on the monetary value of my late husband's legacy. "Richard was a good provider," I answered carefully, a practiced response that revealed nothing. "He made sure we would both be taken care of." I thought that would be the end of it, a momentary curiosity satisfied. But it wasn't. The theme of Ethan's secure future became a recurring motif in our conversations, a favorite melody in her repertoire. She would bring it up in a dozen different ways, her words like little probes, gently testing the defenses around my family's financial history. "It must be such a profound relief for Ethan, knowing he has that kind of safety net," she'd say with a sigh. "It really allows him to take more risks in his career, to not be afraid of failure." It was always framed as a compliment to my late husband's foresight, a testament to his love for his son. But I started to notice a new, insistent undercurrent. It wasn't just idle curiosity. It felt like a systematic reconnaissance. She was mapping the territory, trying to get a clear, detailed picture of the assets she was in the process of marrying into. Even as a small, insistent red flag began to wave in the back of my analytical mind, I did what I had always done throughout my life. I rationalized. I told myself that I was being cynical, that my accountant's brain, trained to look for fraud and malfeasance, was seeing potential liabilities where there was only love and practical, forward-thinking planning. Sarah was simply being a responsible, caring partner, I reasoned with myself in the quiet hours of the night. Of course she would be interested in their shared financial future. It was a sign of maturity, not of greed. When Ethan would call and mention, almost as an aside, that Sarah was just asking about Dad's old stock portfolio again, she's so fascinated by his business sense, I would consciously push down the flicker of unease that coiled in my stomach. I convinced myself that it was normal for a young, ambitious couple to be thinking about these things. I didn't want to become the suspicious, meddling mother-in-law from a bad television show. I wanted, more than anything, to be the supportive, trusting, and beloved matriarch of their burgeoning family. And so I chose to ignore the inconsistencies in her story. I balanced the books of my heart with my own desperate hope, forcing the numbers to fit a narrative I so deeply wanted to be true. I refused to believe that the foundation of their affection for me and for each other might be built on something as cold and calculating as a financial statement. That was a truth my loving, maternal heart simply wasn't ready to audit, a potential bankruptcy of the soul I could not yet bear to face. I am so glad you are here. If you are following this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and let me know what city you are listening from. I want to know how far our story has traveled. The slow, subtle transition from strategic reconnaissance to a full-scale financial assault began, as so many disasters do with real estate. The perfectly nice apartment they were living in, the one whose rent I was already subsidizing each month, was suddenly and irrevocably unsuitable. It was, they explained in a chorus of synchronized complaints, too small for their ambitions, too noisy for Sarah's sensitive nerves, and lacked the amenities befitting a young, upwardly mobile couple. Their solution was a sleek, modern apartment in a trendy downtown high-rise, a gleaming tower of glass and steel with a 24-hour concierge, a heated rooftop pool, and a monthly rent that was nearly double my entire Social Security check. "We can almost afford it, Mom," Ethan had told me over the phone, his voice a carefully crafted blend of youthful excitement and crushing disappointment. "It's just the down payment and the security deposit. It's a huge amount, nearly $15,000, and we'd have to completely empty our savings." A few days later, Sarah came to visit me, alone. This, I would come to realize, was her preferred method of operation. She sat at my small kitchen table, her eyes red-rimmed and brimming with what appeared to be genuine, soul-crushing despair. She held a cup of chamomile tea in her trembling hands and began a performance that was, in its own way, a work of art. She spoke of her deep, abiding love for Ethan and how it pained her, physically pained her, that she couldn't provide him with a home that truly reflected his incredible potential. "I feel like such a failure, Maggie," she whispered, a single, perfect, crystalline tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He works so incredibly hard, and I just want him to have a beautiful, peaceful, impressive place to come home to, a place he can be proud to bring his colleagues." It was a masterful, surgical manipulation aimed directly at the two pillars of my existence, my love for my son and my pride in his success. The implication was clear. My son's happiness and his sense of self-worth were hanging in the balance, and only I, with my checkbook, could save him from his wife's feelings of failure. I relented. Of course I relented. I wrote a check for $15,000, a sum that represented years of my careful, diligent saving for my own future needs. As I handed it to her, she hugged me, her own tears dampening my shoulder. "You are our savior," she had sobbed into my hair. "We will never, ever forget this." She was right about one thing. I would never forget it. That single large transaction became the new normal, the new baseline for our relationship. It was as if my $15,000 check had not just paid for their deposit, but had also purchased them a lifetime, all-access pass to my bank account. The calls for assistance became more frequent, more audacious, and always cloaked in a new, more dramatic, and entirely fabricated crisis. The new apartment, of course, required new furniture to fill its vast empty spaces. Not just any furniture, but designer pieces that Sarah had conveniently bookmarked in a glossy magazine. "It's an investment, Maggie," she had explained with the condescending air of a financial guru, as if I, a retired accountant, didn't understand the concept. Good furniture lasts a lifetime. My credit card, which I had foolishly added her to years ago for emergencies only, began to hemorrhage charges for $5,000 Italian leather sofas and $2,000 minimalist coffee tables. Then came the new car. Their old one, which was perfectly functional, was suddenly unreliable and a danger on the highway. They needed a newer, more prestigious model to maintain their professional image. I was asked to co-sign the loan, a request that put my own perfect credit score at risk, but I did it because they assured me it was just a formality. The phone calls that once began with the cheerful, "Hi, Mom, how are you?" now invariably started with a heavy, dramatic sigh and the ominous phrase, "Mom, I hate to ask, but we have a bit of an emergency." I was no longer a mother they called to share their lives with. I was a first responder they called to extinguish their self-inflicted financial fires. I was paying for their dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants while I ate my own simple, solitary meals of soup and toast at home. I was funding their weekend getaways to Napa Valley while my own idea of a vacation was a trip to the local library. I had become the silent, invisible benefactor of their increasingly lavish lifestyle, a walking, breathing ATM whose only function was to dispense cash and approval, no questions asked. The final, unforgivable act of betrayal, the one that would incinerate the last vestiges of my maternal delusion, unfolded on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. The air in my small, meticulously clean Columbus home was filled with the comforting aroma of a slow-roasting chicken, the scent of rosemary and thyme, a familiar ghost of 1,000 past family dinners. I had set the dining table for 3, using my best china, the delicate rose-patterned plates that Richard and I had received as a wedding gift so many years ago. I was expecting Ethan and Sarah for our monthly dinner, a ritual I clung to with a desperate, foolish hope. I had been hearing persistent rumors through the family grapevine, a whisper from a cousin, a hint from an aunt, that they were finally, officially planning to get married. My heart, despite all the financial strains and the emotional distance, was aflutter with a hopeful, maternal excitement. I couldn't wait to hear all about their plans, to offer my help, to finally step into the cherished role of mother of the groom. I had even, in a fit of optimistic foolishness that now makes me cringe, bought a beautiful pale blue dress to wear on their big day. It was hanging in my closet, a symbol of my enduring and, as it turned out, utterly misplaced faith in them. I imagined a small, elegant ceremony, perhaps in the fall, a day filled with genuine joy and happy tears, a day where I would proudly watch my only son begin his new life. They arrived an hour late, as they often did, with a breezy, superficial apology about insane traffic. Sarah was wearing a new, expensive-looking silk blouse I had never seen before, and Ethan seemed unusually quiet and tense, his eyes avoiding mine. I tried to ignore the strange atmosphere, serving dinner with a forced cheerfulness, filling the awkward, growing silences with chatter about my week, about the neighbors, about anything at all to keep the illusion of a happy family afloat. Finally, as I cleared the dessert plates and poured them coffee, I couldn't contain my excitement any longer. I clasped my hands together, my smile genuine and wide, a beacon of hope in the tense room. "So," I began, my voice brimming with a mother's uncontainable affection, "I've been hearing some absolutely wonderful rumors. Your Aunt Carol told me you two are finally making it official. When is the wedding? Oh, we have so much to plan. I'm so thrilled for you both." I looked from Ethan's suddenly rigid face to Sarah's, expecting a shared smile, a bashful blush, a happy, long-awaited confession. Instead, Sarah took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She placed the cup back on its saucer with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo in the silent room. She looked up at me, not with the warmth of a daughter-in-law sharing joyous news, but with the cold, triumphant, pitiless gaze of a victor. A small, chilling smile played on her perfectly painted red lips. "Oh, Maggie," she said, her voice as smooth and sharp as a shard of ice. "We got married yesterday." The world tilted violently on its axis. The cheerful ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out the peaceful moments of my life for 40 years, seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against my skull. "Yesterday?" I whispered, the word feeling foreign and clumsy in my mouth. "But why didn't you tell me? I have a dress. I was waiting." Sarah's smile widened, and she delivered the final fatal blow, the words that would sever our relationship as cleanly as a guillotine. "It was a very small, private ceremony at the courthouse," she said, her eyes glinting with a cruelty I had never truly seen before. "We only invited special people." Ethan just sat there. He stared intently at his coffee cup, as if it held the secrets of the universe. He was a portrait of spineless, abject cowardice. He didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He didn't even have the basic human decency to look at me. In that one devastating, world-altering moment, I understood everything with a clarity that was both horrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. I wasn't special. I wasn't family. I was just the help. The woman who paid the bills, who funded the lifestyle, who balanced their chaotic books, but who was not worthy of a seat at the most important table of her own son's life. I don't remember them leaving. The rest of the evening is a fractured mosaic of motion without memory, a black hole in the timeline of my life. I must have cleared the plates from the table, my hands moving through the familiar motions of washing and drying the dishes. I must have put away the leftover chicken and turned off the lights in the dining room. My body, trained by decades of domestic duty, must have carried on, a ghost performing the rituals of a life that had just been declared a sham. But my mind, my soul, was frozen in that single horrific moment, trapped in the echo of Sarah's cruel, dismissive words, "special people." I sat alone at my perfectly set dining table for what felt like hours, the chair where Ethan had sat now a gaping, accusingly empty space. My gaze fell upon the third place setting, the one I had so hopefully arranged for Sarah. The uneaten slice of apple pie on her rose-patterned plate seemed to mock me, a sweet, silent testament to her utter contempt. The silence in the house, once a source of peace, was now a heavy, suffocating blanket pressing down on me. Eventually, I walked, as if in a trance, to my bedroom closet and opened the door. The pale blue dress hung there, shimmering softly in the dim light, a beautiful, useless shroud for a dream that had just died a violent, unexpected death. I reached out and touched the soft, cool fabric, and that was when the dam of my rigid composure finally completely broke. But the tears that came were not the hot, messy tears of sadness and loss. They were cold, silent tears of pure, undiluted rage. A rage born of a decade of quiet humiliations, of 1,000 bitten-back words, of $250,000 worth of love and sacrifice thrown back in my face like so much garbage. I wasn't crying for the wedding I had missed. I was crying for the years I had wasted. I was crying for the strong, intelligent, independent woman I had allowed to be diminished into a walking, talking checkbook. I cried for the utter fool I had been, a meticulous accountant who had somehow managed to miscalculate the value of her own worth so catastrophically. The betrayal wasn't just about being excluded from a party. It was the brutal, public declaration that after all I had given, all I had sacrificed, all I had been, I was, in the final accounting of my life, worth absolutely nothing to them. The sum rose the next morning on a different woman. Sometime during that long, dark, tear-filled night, the grief had burned itself out, leaving behind not soft gray ashes, but something hard, clear, and sharp as diamond. The rage remained, a white-hot coal glowing in the pit of my stomach, but it was no longer a chaotic, emotional storm. It had settled, compressed, and transformed into a cold, quiet, and intensely focused resolve. I was an accountant, after all, and when faced with a catastrophic financial loss, a good accountant doesn't weep. They audit. They trace the discrepancies. They document the fraud. They find the hidden assets. And then, with methodical precision, they rebalance the books. And that is exactly what I decided to do with the fraudulent ledger of my own life. I made myself a pot of strong black coffee, the bitter taste a welcome shock to my system, and sat down at my dining room table. This morning, it was not a family table. It was my war room. I retrieved my old laptop and pulled out the boxes of financial records I had meticulously kept for years. I opened a new spreadsheet. The title I typed was simple, cold, and legally precise. Undocumented loans issued to Ethan and Sarah Vance. I began to enter the numbers, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a professional accuracy I hadn't felt in years. The $30,000 for the spectacularly failed startup, the $5,000 for the pre-honeymoon trip to Italy, the $15,000 for the apartment security deposit, the $86,000 toward the down payment on their first house, the monthly rent subsidies, the car payments, the endless credit card bills I had covered without question. Each entry was a small, painful memory, a ghost of my own foolishness, but I refused to let emotion cloud my judgment. This was a forensic accounting of my own life, and my feelings were an irrelevant variable. I worked for hours, fueled by black coffee and a righteous, simmering fury. When I was finally done, after tracing every significant transaction for the past 10 years, I stared at the final number in the total cell at the bottom of the spreadsheet. It glowed on the screen, a monument to my own misplaced generosity. $217,453.18. Over a decade, that was the precise, calculated price I had paid for the illusion of a loving family. As I stared at that number, a thought, cold and clear as a shard of ice, began to form in my mind. Why had they been in such a desperate hurry to get married? Why the secrecy? It had to be about money. It was always, always about money with them. And then, like a forgotten key turning in a rusty lock, I remembered. Richard, my brilliant, far-sighted husband, his will. He had been a loving man, but he had never been a fool. He had never been blind to Ethan's fundamental weaknesses or to Sarah's grasping, ambitious nature. I went to the old, heavy safe hidden behind a landscape painting in my study, a place only Richard and I had ever known about. I spun the familiar combination, my fingers sure and steady, and the heavy door swung open with a soft sigh. Inside, amongst my own important papers, was a thick, leather-bound folder, untouched since his death. The embossed gold letters on the front read, "The Richard Vance Trust for the benefit of Ethan Vance." I took it out, my hands trembling ever so slightly with a dawning, electric anticipation. I had read it years ago, but in my grief I hadn't paid close attention to the dense legal fine print. Now I read it as if my life depended on it, and in a way it did. I scanned through the dense legalese, my accountant's eye picking out the key phrases, until I found the section I was instinctively searching for. Article 5, Conditions for Primary Distribution. The trust, which contained a very considerable sum of $500,000, was set up to provide Ethan with a secure future. But Richard, in his infinite protective wisdom, had included a series of powerful clauses. And there it was in crisp black and white, the key to my own liberation. The principal of the trust was to be distributed to Ethan upon one of two conditions: his 40th birthday or his legal marriage. But then came the masterstroke, a sentence so brilliant, so perfectly tailored to this exact situation that it made me gasp. Said distribution upon marriage is contingent upon the formal, written approval of the sole trustee, who shall have the absolute and final discretion to determine if the chosen spouse is of sound and reputable character and is not, in the trustee's judgment, acting out of undue financial motivation. I flipped to the final page, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sole trustee, appointed for life with no possibility of removal, was Margaret Maggie Vance. A slow, cold, and deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. They thought their secret wedding was the key that would unlock their fortune. They had no idea that I was the gatekeeper, and I had just changed all the locks. My first act of this new, undeclared war was not to attack, but to fortify. As a meticulous accountant, I knew that the best defense, and ultimately the best offense, was a well-documented, irrefutable, and perfectly organized paper trail. I spent the rest of that day and the next in my study, transforming it from a quiet room of memories into a strategic command center. I started with the damning spreadsheet I had created, printing out a detailed, itemized summary of the $217,000 they had systematically siphoned from me over the last decade. But a summary wasn't enough. I needed proof. I cross-referenced every major transaction with my old archived bank statements, highlighting the corresponding withdrawals with a bright red marker. I dug through my files and found the carbon copy of the cashier's check for their first apartment deposit. I found the wire transfer confirmation for Ethan's failed startup. I pulled the endless credit card statements showing the charges for their lavish dinners, their designer clothes, their weekend getaways, all paid for by me. I compiled it all into a single, thick, and damning dossier, each page a cold, hard testament to their calculated exploitation and my foolish, blind love. The sheer volume of the evidence was staggering, even to me. Seeing it all laid out in black and white, the cold, hard numbers stripped of all emotional context, I felt a familiar wave of shame at my own naivety, but it was quickly replaced by a hardening, empowering resolve. This was not the accounting of a loving mother's generous gifts. This was the evidence of a long-term, systematic financial fraud. My next step was to secure a powerful alliance. I knew I couldn't and shouldn't fight this battle alone. I needed professional, unbiased counsel, someone who understood the intricate language of trusts and estates and who had no emotional stake in the outcome. I remembered Arthur Peterson, my late husband's estate lawyer and a trusted family friend for over 30 years. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 70s, semi-retired, but still possessing a legal mind like a steel trap. I called him. "Arthur," I said, my voice calm and businesslike, utterly devoid of the broken woman I had been just 2 days prior. "It's Maggie Vance. I need to schedule an urgent and completely confidential meeting. It's regarding Richard's will, and specifically the trust he set up for Ethan." The uncharacteristic urgency in my tone must have been palpable, because he agreed to see me the very next morning, clearing his calendar for me. I arrived at his quiet, book-lined office carrying my dossier of financial records and the heavy, leather-bound trust document. I laid it all out for him on his large oak desk, starting with the story of the secret wedding and the cruel special people comment, and ending with my discovery of the sound character clause. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I presented the facts as if I were presenting a final audit to a board of directors. Arthur listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression growing grimmer and more thunderous with each detail I shared. He read through the trust document slowly, his eyes lingering on Article 5. He then spent a long, silent time examining my spreadsheet and the accompanying bank statements, occasionally letting out a low whistle of sheer disbelief. When I was finally done, he leaned back in his chair and was silent for a full minute, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if in deep thought. "Maggie," he said finally, his voice a low rumble of controlled, righteous anger, "Richard was an even smarter man than I gave him credit for. He saw this coming. He saw her for exactly what she is, and he built you a fortress." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound sympathy and a newfound deep admiration. "This clause," he said, tapping the document with a long, wrinkled finger, "is ironclad. It is legally unassailable. As the sole trustee, your discretion is absolute and final." They thought getting married was a clever loophole to get their hands on the money. Instead, they handed you the very weapon you need to legally and permanently stop them. His validation was like a balm to my wounded, angry soul. I wasn't being vengeful or crazy. I was acting within my full legal and moral rights. "So, what is our next move, Arthur?" I asked, feeling a surge of strength and clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Our next move, Maggie," Arthur said with a grim, determined smile, "is to wait. We let them make the first move. We let them walk right up to the vault, drunk on their perceived victory, and formally request the key. And that is when we will very politely and very legally lower the boom." The plan that Arthur and I devised that morning was a masterpiece of strategic, calculated patience. It was a legal and psychological trap, and the bait, we knew, was my silence. We correctly gambled that Ethan and Sarah, flush with the triumph of their secret wedding and utterly convinced that I was a defeated, heartbroken old woman, would not wait long to claim their prize. Their greed, Arthur assured me with the certainty of a man who had seen it all before, would make them predictable and reckless. My role in this silent opera was simple, yet emotionally taxing. I had to play the part of the victim they so clearly believed me to be. I had to let them think that their cruelty had worked, that I was broken beyond repair. So I retreated into a carefully constructed cocoon of silence. I did not call, I did not text. I let Ethan's increasingly frantic calls go straight to voicemail. Each evening, I would sit in my armchair and listen to the messages he left, not with pain, but with the detached, analytical interest of a strategist studying her opponent's movements. The first few messages were dripping with a transparently false, syrupy concern. "Mom, it's Ethan. We're just so worried about you. Please, just let us know that you're all right." When those received no reply, the tone shifted, as we knew it would, to undisguised frustration. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just cut us off. This silent treatment isn't solving anything. We need to talk." His desperation was music to my ears. It wasn't the sound of a son worried about his mother's well-being. It was the sound of an addict being cut off from his supply. While I maintained my strategic silence, I began to act, quietly and decisively, to fortify my own position. On Arthur's astute advice, I started to build a financial firewall. I went to my local bank and met with the manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, who had known me for years. I explained, without going into the messy, emotional details, that I was undergoing a significant restructuring of my personal finances following a family disagreement. I opened a new set of accounts at a different branch, under my name only, with no joint access. Over the next 2 weeks, I began the process of slowly and quietly transferring the majority of my personal liquid assets from the accounts that Ethan and Sarah knew about, leaving only a modest, believable amount behind. I also changed all my online banking passwords and security questions, creating new ones that were impenetrable, based on details from my life long before Ethan was even born. I was building a financial fortress, brick by digital brick, ensuring that when the inevitable fallout came, they would have absolutely no recourse to my personal funds. It was a strange, deeply empowering feeling, taking methodical control of my own security after years of allowing my boundaries to be slowly and systematically eroded. The most difficult part of the plan was the performance. A week after the disastrous Sunday dinner, Ethan called again, his voice now a carefully controlled, almost gentle monotone. It was so obviously rehearsed that I could almost picture Sarah in the room with him, mouthing the words, coaching his performance. "Mom," he said, his voice laced with a heavy, sorrowful sigh, "I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. We handled things badly. We were wrong, but we need to move forward for Dad's sake." He then got to the real transactional point of the call. "Sarah and I have been talking to a lawyer about Dad's trust. It seems that now that we're legally married, we can finally access the funds. It would really help us get a proper start in life, the way Dad always wanted." I took a deep, shaky breath, summoning every ounce of my inner actress. I let a weary, broken sigh escape my lips. "Ethan," I said, my voice deliberately frail and trembling, "I'm so tired. I'm just so tired. I don't have the strength to fight about these things anymore. Your father, he always wanted you to be happy. If this is what you need to do, then just do what you think is right. I can't deal with lawyers and papers right now. I just can't." I could almost hear the silent, triumphant cheer from Sarah on the other end of the line. "Thanks, Mom," Ethan said, a note of palpable, profound relief flooding his voice. "You won't regret this. I promise. This will make everything better. You'll see." I hung up the phone and sat in the silence, my face a mask of sorrow. But inside, a cold, hard smile was forming. They had taken the bait. Now all I had to do was wait for them to walk into the trap. And Richard, my clever, far-sighted husband, had built a masterpiece of legal protection. He had given me, his quiet, unassuming accountant wife, the ultimate authority. He had made me the judge, the jury, and the sole executioner of their financial dreams. Believing that I had been thoroughly neutralized by grief and emotional exhaustion, Ethan and Sarah moved with a speed and audacity that was truly breathtaking. Within a mere 48 hours of my carefully staged surrender on the phone, a formal registered letter from their lawyer arrived at Arthur Peterson's office. It was a bold, confident, and legally aggressive demand for the immediate dissolution and subsequent distribution of the Richard Vance Trust. The letter cited Article 5 of the document and included a crisp, clean, notarized copy of their newly minted marriage certificate as irrefutable proof that all necessary conditions for the release of the funds had been met. Arthur called me the very moment the letter arrived, his voice a low chuckle of grim satisfaction. "The fish have taken the bait, Maggie," he said, and I could picture the thin, satisfied smile on his face. "And they've swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. We've got them." Ethan and Sarah, utterly and completely convinced that their $500,000 payday was now just a matter of processing some simple paperwork, began to live as if the money was already in their account. The transformation was immediate and grotesque. I learned through my sister, who, with a heavy heart, had agreed to act as my reluctant informant, that they had put a non-refundable $20,000 down payment on a much larger, ostentatiously modern house in an exclusive gated community on the other side of town. It was a payment made, no doubt, with a high-interest short-term bridge loan they were supremely confident they could pay off in a matter of weeks. Their self-satisfaction was almost comical in its lack of subtlety. They treated their impending fortune as a foregone conclusion, a prize they had cleverly won through their own cunning and superior strategy. Sarah, emboldened by their perceived victory, promptly quit her job as a marketing assistant, telling her colleagues with a dramatic flair that she was leaving the workforce to focus on managing her family's new and extensive investment portfolio. She began a relentless campaign on social media, posting a stream of pictures of herself shopping at high-end boutiques, posing with designer handbags and expensive shoes, always accompanied by cloying, smug captions like "a little retail therapy to celebrate our new chapter" and #living our best life. It was a breathtaking, vulgar display of arrogance and presumption. They were so blinded by the glittering dollar signs, so certain of their triumph, that they never once stopped to consider the quiet, unassuming gatekeeper who held the only key to the vault. They had made the classic, fatal mistake of all truly arrogant people. They had completely and utterly underestimated their opponent. They saw a quiet, lonely 71-year-old widow, a woman easily dismissed. They didn't see the meticulous, detail-oriented accountant who had all the receipts, both literal and metaphorical. They didn't see the grieving wife who was now armed with the final, brilliant, and fiercely protective gesture of her late husband. They were dancing with giddy abandon on the very edge of a deep financial cliff, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one who was about to give them the final, gentle, and legally binding push. The meeting was set, the stage was prepared, the final act of their tragic comedy of greed was about to begin. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday morning in the formal, wood-paneled conference room of Arthur Peterson's long-established law firm. The room itself seemed to disapprove of them. It was a space that radiated old-world power, quiet dignity, and gravitas, a stark contrast to the flashy glass and chrome office of their own lawyer. Ethan and Sarah arrived looking like they had just stepped out of a magazine spread about the young and successful. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that was clearly new, and she was dressed in a chic, expensive-looking cream dress, a brand-new designer handbag clutched in her hand like a trophy. They walked in with an air of barely concealed impatience, as if this meeting was a mere, tiresome formality, a bureaucratic hoop to jump through before their real, fabulous lives could finally begin. I was already seated at the long, polished mahogany table when they entered, a quiet, gray-haired woman in a simple but elegant navy dress of my own. I looked up, offered a cool, neutral nod, and said nothing. Arthur sat at the head of the table, a single, thick, leather-bound document, Richard's Trust, neatly arranged before him. "Ethan, Sarah, thank you for coming in this morning," Arthur began, his voice calm, professional, and utterly unreadable. "We are here today to formally review your petition for the distribution of the Richard Vance Trust as per the conditions outlined in the deceased's will." He gestured to the copy of their marriage certificate they had sent. "We have received a copy of this document, which does indeed confirm your legal marriage, thus triggering a review under Article 5 of the trust." Sarah beamed, unable to contain herself, and exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Ethan. She leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped her expensive handbag. "So, it's all in order then?" she asked, her voice sharp with eagerness. "How long does the transfer process usually take? We have a closing date on a new property coming up." Arthur held up a hand, a gesture that was both polite and commanding. "Not so fast," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, becoming more serious. "As you know, the will stipulates that before any distribution can be made, the sole trustee, that is, Mrs. Vance, must formally assess and approve the character of the new spouse." He turned his steady, unwavering gaze to me. "Maggie, the floor is yours. As the trustee, do you have any comments regarding this matter before we proceed?" This was my moment, the moment I had been rehearsing in my mind for weeks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't betray a single flicker of emotion. I simply reached into my handbag and pulled out my own folder. "I do, Arthur," I said, my voice as clear and steady as a church bell on a calm morning. I pulled out the first document, the meticulously crafted spreadsheet I had prepared. My first comment concerns a series of undocumented, unsecured, and as of yet unrepaid loans I have personally made to the couple over the past 10 years, totaling $217,453.18. I slid a neatly printed copy across the polished table to them. Ethan's face went completely pale. Sarah stared at the columns of numbers as if they were written in a foreign language she couldn't comprehend. Those are not loans," Sarah stammered, finding her voice. "They were gifts. You know they were gifts." "Were they?" I countered, raising a single questioning eyebrow. "That's very interesting, because I have no record of any gift tax forms ever being filed with the IRS. As a former accountant, I find that to be a very curious oversight." I continued, my voice gaining strength and momentum with every word. I recounted the story of the secret wedding. I quoted her cruel, dismissive words back to her. "We only invited special people." I laid out the evidence of their systematic financial exploitation, my voice never wavering. For every point, I had a document. For every claim, I had a date and a number. I was no longer a grieving mother pleading for love. I was an accountant presenting my final, damning, and irrefutable audit. When I had finished laying out the decade-long, meticulously documented history of their financial and emotional exploitation, I paused. I let the weight of my words, the sheer, crushing gravity of the numbers and the lies, settle into the stunned silence of the room. Ethan was staring at the polished surface of the table, his face ashen, the perfect picture of a man whose carefully constructed reality had just been systematically demolished before his eyes. Sarah, however, was rallying. I could see the defiance, the pure, unadulterated rage of a cornered animal hardening in her eyes. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice sharp with a theatrical indignation that no longer had any effect on me. "This is a personal family matter. It has absolutely nothing to do with the trust. We are legally married. The will is clear. The money is his." "You are correct about one thing," Arthur interjected smoothly, his voice cutting through her tirade like a sharp knife. He picked up the heavy, leather-bound trust document. "The will is perfectly clear." He turned to the page he had marked with a small red tab. "It states, and I quote, that the trustee, Mrs. Vance, shall have absolute and final discretion to determine if the chosen spouse is of sound and reputable character and is not, in the trustee's sole judgment, acting out of undue financial motivation." He took off his glasses and looked at Sarah with an expression of almost paternal pity. "Frankly, my dear, your actions over the past several years have provided a textbook dictionary definition example of undue financial motivation." I then delivered my final judgment, the words I had longed to say, the words Richard had given me the power to speak. I looked directly at my son and then at the woman who had so thoroughly corrupted him. "As the sole trustee of the Richard Vance Trust," I began, my voice clear, calm, and unwavering, and based on the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence of a long-term pattern of financial manipulation, deceit, and profound personal disrespect, I find the character of Mrs. Sarah Vance to be fundamentally unsound and unsuitable. I took a deep, steadying breath. Therefore, I am officially and irrevocably denying the petition for the distribution of the trust's assets. Sarah's face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You can't do that!" she shrieked, leaping to her feet so quickly that her chair almost toppled over. "That money is ours! It's Ethan's birthright!" "I can," I replied, my voice now as cold as the grave, "and I have. Arthur, if you would be so kind as to inform them of the remaining conditions." Arthur nodded grimly. "As per the will, the funds will now remain in the trust, under Mrs. Vance's sole management. The next condition for a potential distribution will be Mr. Vance's 40th birthday, which is 5 years from now, provided, of course, that on that date he is no longer legally married to you, Sarah." The color drained completely from Sarah's face. She stared at Ethan, her eyes blazing with a furious, accusatory fire. "You see!" she screamed at him, her voice cracking with hysteria. "This is what you get for being a weak, pathetic mama's boy. You've lost us everything." Ethan finally looked up, his eyes filled with a dawning, devastating horror as he finally truly understood the full scope of what his weakness and her boundless greed had cost them. The treasure chest was locked, and the woman they had scorned, discarded, and humiliated held the only key. The immediate aftermath of that fateful meeting was not a slow, graceful decline. It was a catastrophic financial freefall. They received no money from the trust, not a single cent. Worse, their entire financial house of cards, which had been precariously built on the absolute assumption of an imminent $500,000 windfall, came crashing down around them with a speed that was breathtaking. The high-interest, short-term bridge loan they had taken out for the down payment on their new luxury home was called in by the lender. With no funds to cover it and no prospect of any, they were immediately facing a lawsuit for default. They lost their hefty $20,000 deposit and were saddled with a crushing new debt that they had no means to repay. To add legal insult to financial injury, Arthur, on my behalf, formally filed a civil suit to reclaim the $217,000 they had methodically taken from me over the years. I had no real expectation of ever seeing that money again. That wasn't the point. The point was the lawsuit itself. It placed a legal, documented claim on any future assets they might acquire, a financial ghost that would haunt them for years to come, ensuring they would be paying, in one way or another, for their decade of deceit. Their lavish, Instagram-worthy lifestyle evaporated overnight. The designer clothes, the fancy dinners, the weekend trips, all of it came to a screeching, humiliating halt. They were forced to break the lease on their trendy downtown apartment, incurring even more penalties, and move into a small, run-down rental on the industrial side of town, a place with thin walls and the constant smell of diesel fumes. The weight of their financial ruin, combined with the profound humiliation of their failed scheme, proved to be more than their shallow marriage could bear. Their relationship, which I now understood was never a partnership of love, but a business arrangement based on a shared greed, dissolved into a toxic cesspool of bitter blame and unending resentment. Sarah, having lost the grand prize she had so carefully schemed for, saw no more value in Ethan. She saw him now for what he was, a weak man with no prospects. She left him less than 2 months after the meeting at Arthur's office, filing for a vicious divorce in which she tried and failed to claim that he had hidden assets from her. The last I heard, through the family grapevine, she had moved back in with her long-suffering parents, her dreams of being a wealthy, influential socialite in ashes around her. Ethan was left utterly alone to face the consequences of his choices. He was forced to sell the nice car I had helped him buy and take a second job waiting tables at a Greasy Spoon diner at night just to make ends meet and begin the impossible task of paying off the mountain of debt he had accumulated. He was a man adrift, having lost his inheritance, his wife, his mother's trust, and any shred of his own self-respect. He had traded it all away for a few years of a lifestyle he couldn't afford and the fleeting approval of a woman who had never truly loved him. The social fallout was quiet but complete. The story of their failed scheme, while not public news, spread like wildfire through family and mutual acquaintances. They became a cautionary tale about greed and disrespect. They had gambled everything on the foolish belief that I was a weak, sentimental old woman, and they had lost in the most spectacular and definitive fashion imaginable. In the quiet, peaceful months that followed, I began the final and most important rebalancing of my life's ledger. With Arthur's help, I made some compassionate yet firm changes to Richard's trust. I wasn't a vindictive woman. I was, at my core, an accountant. So I structured a new clause, a path to redemption. When Ethan turns 40, if, and only if, he has demonstrated 5 consecutive years of proven financial independence, gainful employment, and personal responsibility, a small, managed portion of the trust's income will be made available to him. He would not be rewarded for his past betrayal, but he would have a chance to earn a future, built on his own hard work, the difficult, character-building lesson Richard had always wanted him to learn. With a portion of the annual interest generated by the trust, money that I was legally entitled to as the trustee, I established a small foundation in my late husband's name, the Richard Vance Scholarship for Financial Literacy. It provides grants to young, underprivileged students in our community who want to pursue degrees in business and accounting. I found a profound, quiet joy in helping these bright, deserving young people get the honest start in life that my own son had so carelessly squandered. My life became my own again, fully and completely. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local gardening club, and even took that trip to Italy, the one I had paid for years ago but had never been invited on. I went by myself, and it was glorious. One afternoon, many months later, Ethan called. His voice was different, quiet, humbled, and devoid of the old, easy entitlement. He didn't ask for money. He asked if I would be willing to meet him for a simple cup of coffee. He told me about his 2 jobs, about the bone-deep exhaustion, but also about a strange new feeling of pride in paying his own rent, in standing on his own 2 feet. It was the first tentative step on a long, uncertain road. I don't know if our relationship will ever fully recover its former warmth, but I do know this. Richard's final lesson was his greatest gift. He taught me that numbers, in the end, never lie. And after a lifetime of balancing the books for others, I had finally learned how to read the balance sheet of my own life. I had cut my losses, written off the bad debt, and invested in the one asset that was truly priceless, my own hard-won peace of mind.